Hello and welcome back to Commercial Fishing Radio. Did you know that when minority groups lobby for commercial fishing closures, they are actually lobbying to remove the public's access to seafood? Just something to ponder, I guess. This episode, we will be taking a look into some of the areas that the seafood consumers have lost to minority groups, but also, we will look into the radical movement within the recreational sector and how they are literally taking the local seafood off your plates and the bait off your hooks. The Victorian government has removed access to areas from seafood consumers by reallocating the access to the recreational sector. This is, in fact, an excellent example of nonsense policy, where commercial fishermen have been removed, with the recreational lobbyists arguing that it is unsustainable. Although then the government plans to attract a further 250,000 recreational fishers to the state through the removal of those fishermen. I interviewed Jonathan Davey from Victoria. Jonathan is the Executive Officer of Seafood Industry Victoria. So, Jonathan, what is this Target 1 million policy in Victoria, and what have been the major impacts for seafood since the 2014 election?
Yeah, good question, Dane. So the policy itself has three key deliverables, I guess. The first one, obviously, being increasing the recreational fishing numbers to 1 million participants by 2022, off the top of my head. And they're going to be delivering that through a range of different measures, both financial and promotional activities. The second was the removal of commercial net fishing within Port Phillip Bay by 2022, and also looking at the banning net fishing in river mouths of the Gippsland Lakes. Obviously, of those three, the two that impact the commercial fishing industry were removing net fishing in Port Phillip Bay and the banning of nets from river mouths in the Gippsland Lakes. And they obviously have the direct impact on seafood consumers, all Victorians and broader Australians, for the stuff that gets sent interstate, through impacting the amount and the sort of the different species available of fresh local seafood in fresh markets. So removing the net fishing in Port Phillip Bay will see up to 750 tonnes of fresh fish removed from the market, both through seafood and supply of bait to the recreational fishers, while the Gippsland Lakes commitment at the moment is being worked through between government and industry to try and make sure that it doesn't have an impact on seafood consumers.
There's a big comparison there within the three states, or maybe more, to be honest. The biggest losers in every state are the seafood consumers.
Couldn't agree more. We've got at the moment in South Australia, there's certain regional communities calling for net fishing to be reinstated after it was removed many years ago, because the fish are still there. There was no sustainability issue. The decision, has been done based on incorrect information, and now they're trying to reverse it all. I mean, we're at the moment seeing bumper seasons in Victoria for whiting and other species, where recreationals are bagging out in no time. Commercials are out there catching it as well. There is no conflict whatsoever, because the environmental conditions, the recruitment behaviours have actually led to the fish being available. Over the past 5 years, that hasn't been the case. There's been a lull in recruitment 5 years beforehand, so there's been no fish coming through. And all of a sudden, we're now seeing everyone pretty happy with how things are fishing, except for the consumer who's sitting there going, where'd the 700 tonnes of fish go?
Generally, or typically rather, government seem to look at the first point of sale amount that the industry's worth, but I tend to look at how many small businesses are affected by these closures. So how many in Victoria are we talking with small businesses?
That's a good question. It's one, and as you say, the fact that all of the figures, all of the data that's provided is done on that beach landing price. Really good question. I would hate to have a stab at a number. I mean, immediately we've got 43 who have been affected, either by being bought out or through having the number of fish that they can catch reduced. So there's 43 that have been affected straight off the bat. Then all of a sudden you've got the wholesalers, processors, retailers, restaurants, bait shops, fish and chip shops. I could go on. Apparently, the financial strength and importance of these small businesses to Victoria just wasn't as important as the sale of imported tackle and the overinflated economic benefit that's been promoted through these reports of recreational fishing to the state of Victoria.
I've seen that in a number of states where the overinflation of the economic benefit of the recreational sector. One of the examples is the bait and tackle shops. The benefit that is derived by them goes to the recreational sector, when I thought that we supplied the bait that they sold.
We do, obviously. I mean, one other fairly concerning factor here along the south coast is a couple of years ago, I think it was back in 2006, 2007, there was a real decline in the number of pilchards, anchovies, all the different baits that are caught by commercial fishing. And so there was an increase in imported product. That imported product came in with diseases, no testing, no requirements for it to be inspected, etc. And it resulted in a massive die-off even further when the pilchard stocks were starting to recover across the coast. And so we're obviously going to have in Victoria more imports of sardines, pilchards, whitebait from either other states or overseas, because we're just not going to have the Purseine fishery, which was operating in Port Phillip Bay. It was supplying roughly 200 tonnes of those pilchards, whitebait, sardines and other products that will no longer be available.
By them arguing for this closure in Port Phillip Bay, they've ultimately impacted the abilities of the recreational sector itself to function properly.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, all recreational fishers are aware that the best bait is fresh local bait.
Mm.
With that no longer being available, we've obviously got one fisher who has decided to stay on because he got so much reward out of providing bait to recreational fishers. You know, I think it was about a week or two before the legislation entered into Parliament. We had letters of support coming in from all the local bait suppliers, who are the guys supplying into the tackle shops and the service stations. You know, they understand the significance of the bait fishery in Port Phillip Bay. And the radicals, as you put it, who were out there doing the campaigning to remove all net fishing, didn't realise, hey, net fishing actually provides a benefit to us.
Yeah,
and
funny.
Now they've lost that. So, I mean, unless we can come to the table and sit down and work out how do we retain some of the bait fishing, how do we retain some of the net fishing to actually continue supplying fresh local seafood to the consumers, but also supporting a very important recreational sector, you know, someone needs to come and start that discussion.
That's exactly right. The genuine recreational fishers really need to separate themselves from that radical movement, because the way they're actually going to affect their recreational fishing at the end of the day as well. So anyway, finally, Jonathan, is there any particular message you want to send seafood consumers?
Oh, look, I think in Victoria, we at the moment, you know, we've seen King George whiting prices that have risen in retail outlets to well over $50 a kilo. You've seen fresh pilchard, salmon, pike, garfish, species that have just dropped out of shop windows, off restaurant menus, all because the government were convinced that the recreational fishing provided more to the state economy than what the seafood sector did, supporting restaurants, supporting fish and chip shops, etc. So I guess one thing that I really would like to get out there is for the seafood consumer, whenever you go to a local fish and chip shop, when you go to a local restaurant, when you go to your local fishmonger, simply ask the question where the fish is from. You know, if people start building an awareness of where their fish is from, actually having a desire for sourcing their local protein source, that's obviously going to be the best thing for us as an industry, Australia-wide. You know, we're always going to have to live with imports because we can't catch enough to fill that void of the demand for seafood. So we're obviously working with the importers, make sure that people actually want seafood. And one other thing, follow us on Facebook at Victorian Seafood, because we're regularly putting up, you know, helpful information and identifying current issues to try and raise people's awareness.
Well, thank you very much for joining me, Jonathan.
No worries, Dane. Thanks for the opportunity.
Recreational fishers need to be wary of the extreme movement that purports to represent them. There is a culture now of removing commercial fishers under the banner of resource sharing and user conflict. Our professional industry is among the world leaders in sustainable harvesting. Recreational fishers that jump on the bandwagon of these closures, regardless of the facts, run the risk of being closed down themselves. I also interviewed Chris Wallace. Chris is the chairman of EcoFishers, a peak representative body for recreational fishers in New South Wales. G'day Chris, how you going?
Yeah, I'm well, thanks, Dane. How's yourself?
Pretty good, actually. Chris, it was a breath of fresh air to meet a representative of recreational fishers that wasn't brainwashed by the misinformation out there. So, have you always had an open mind to what is a very heavily managed commercial industry?
Dane, the short answer is no. I was a typical recreational fisherman, and not a very good one, I might add. Like most rec fishers, if I found it difficult to catch a fish, and I saw trawlers and netters around bringing in boxes of fish, my automatic reaction was that the pros had got all the fish. And I think there's probably many uneducated reckies out there that still think that way to this day. This bias carried into my early days in EcoFishers, and in fact, at the time, we were at the forefront of trying to get nets banned in estuaries and lakes ourselves. Our change of heart came about when this commercial fishing reform was first put forward, and we noticed that apart from being totally unfair, there was a lot of problems for the rec sector if it went through in its present form. And by taking an interest in the reform, we had to learn about the commercial fishing methods. I've come to learn about bycatch reduction devices, the targeting of species, environmental concerns, and the fact that commercial fishing and fish stocks are certified by the government as being sustainable. And our major fear is that because this reform favours big business, there's a distinct danger that if commercial fishing does survive in New South Wales, it will eventually fall into the hands of foreign interests.
How do you feel about the extreme noisy minority that cause issues for the commercial fishing industry?
Yeah, well, I do agree there is a noisy minority that are trying to gain traction with the government and/or sections of the rec fishing industry at the expense of the commercial fishing industry. At the same time, I believe that most thinking recreational fishers acknowledge that there's many user groups using the same resource. There's not only fishermen, both recreational and commercial, but we've also got pleasure boating, sailing, say jet skiers, paddleboarders, kayakers, and I'd like to think that we respect the rights and privileges that all those user groups have. There's one phrase coming up these days, the phrase user conflict, I think is an abomination that will eventually work against any group that promotes it.
Yeah, no argument from me on that, mate. So when these so-called representatives of the recreational sector, the extreme ones, when they lobby governments for closures to commercial fishing, when commercial fishing has the sustainability credentials backing it. Do you think this will have implications on the recreational sector at a later date?
Oh, of course I do. Recreational fishers are the main customers of commercial fishing, apart from the fact that virtually all our bait is caught by pros. We're also huge consumers of local seafood. I think we have very few celebrations in Australia that don't involve a couple of kilos of prawns. I know many rec fishers will order local fish when they go out to a restaurant. And of course, on the days when you've gone fishing, promised the family a feed, and you've barely caught a cold, there's nothing else to do but drop in the co-op and see if you can get some fish there. I think, above all, the major problems with allocating closures to commercial fishing without scientific evidence to back it up is you leave the back door open for governments and or extreme green groups to do exactly the same to rec fishers down the track. I mean, they do now, and they don't need any encouragement from within our own sector.
Yeah, I agree. Finally, mate, I understand you're not from Queensland or Victoria, but what do you make of the fact that seafood consumers have now lost their access to seafood in a vast amount of area in Queensland and Victoria, even though the science backed in the commercial sector?
Yeah, well, I view the similarities here in both states, that both those states accidentally elected a Labor government, and probably both states now wish they hadn't. The Victorian case in particular, that beggars belief with me, in that during the last election, both major parties were pressured into promising Port Phillip Bay closures by a national recreational fishing lobby group who have financial stakes in the rec fishing industry. Now, the mechanics of this closure seem pretty ridiculous, with the banning of a dozen or so pro fishers because of the concerns about fish stocks. And at the same time, they set a target to increase the number of rec fishers in that state by 250,000 people. In the Queensland case, from memory, the Labor Party, I think, was the only one promising net-free zones. And then they happened to get elected, and they just simply rolled out the legislation without any consultation at all. I'm no expert. I'm not in a position to know whether or not those closures were warranted, and none of us will ever know, because there's no scientific research whatsoever into the reasons behind all those closures. But to my mind, these decisions can be very dangerous for the recreational sector, because the commercial fishing industry was listed as sustainable in both states, and the same unscientific argument can be used against us in the future.
Well, thanks very much for joining me, Chris.
Yep, no worries. Just hope that we can all keep fishing, eh? Whether we do it for a living or do it for fun, fishing's fishing, isn't it?
That's right. Talk to you later.
Okay, Dane. Thank you.
For those who want to join the Eco Fishers, just visit the website. It's www.ecofishers.com. The non-fishing community around Australia has lost a large amount of access to one of its iconic wild-caught species, the barramundi, and many other species to go with it, with the ground closures throughout Queensland. Commercial fishermen have been removed with no science, and this is again to appease the radical recreational lobbyists that make up the minority of the population. I interviewed Eric Perez from Queensland. Eric is the Chief Executive Officer of Queensland Seafood Industry Association. Hi Eric, how are you going today?
Good, mate. Good. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to have a chat with you.
Yeah, not a problem. So Eric, how many areas in Queensland are the seafood consumers now locked out of?
If you add the 3 net-free zones that were recently legislated by the state government up here, it's well over the 200 mark now. So on a coastline as big as Queensland's, we've got over 200 areas that are restricted to commercial take of seafood. So that's the current situation that we face, and some of your listeners may know that we've got a green paper here at the moment.
Yeah, so what I've heard from the government in Queensland, they seem to make it about the commercial fishers having the major impact. But does this have a larger impact on the supply chain, do you think?
If we're talking about the net-free zones, then yes, and it's something that never really featured in their advertising of the policy. And your listeners should note as well that we were told about the state government's sustainable fisheries policy 2 days before the last state election. So the amount of scrutiny that legislation had was almost nil until it was introduced. So yeah, from the perspective of the broader supply chain, no, that was never factored into the thinking when the net-free zones were introduced, and it's still having ongoing effects to those that were accessing fresh local caught fish in particular, because we're talking about net-free zones here. So much so that some of the media that was put out by the department, and then Minister Burns, who said that it was only about 1 or 0.5% of the total barramundi catch in the country, and he used those statistics specifically to cover the fact that if you look at the percentage of barramundi that was going to be lost in Queensland alone, it was closer to about a third of the barramundi that we were taking for sale to consumers. So thanks to that process, and including barramundi and other fish species, our estimate is that of the Fitzroy region was about 1.2 million serves of fish were lost to the system in terms of sales to the community. So we were working on a 150-gram portion of fish being sold through retail and restaurant outlets. All that's now gone and can only be accessed by professional anglers who now have exclusive rights to that area to go commercially fishing. So yeah, lots of outcomes from this policy, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's actually a lot of seafood to be lost, isn't it? So what about the impacts on the mental health of fishing families? Has that been recognised through these net-free zones?
From an official policy point of view, no. The government did at one point towards the end of the process when they were packaging up what they were going to offer impacted fishers, that there were counselling options available to them as a community, but there wasn't a lot more than that done. And yeah, look, the impact on families has been pretty severe. Some have moved on, some have had to go and fish in other parts of the fishery, and that's one of those unintended consequences. Although the department would have surely advised the minister at the time that with these closures, that because our net fishermen are typically working in multiple endorsements, so that they can fish in other fisheries at different times of the year to be able to supplement their income. A good proportion of them don't just net fish all year round. The loss of that net symbol meant that they could now go and do more crabbing or something else, which means moving into other areas, which means increasing pressure in other parts of different fisheries, which then start to cycle up again of having potentially too many commercial fishers in one area. Then we get back to this thing of, well, we need to reduce numbers because there's just too many. It just kicks off that cycle again. And yep. I don't think the previous minister was aware of it, or if he did, whether he cared or not, we don't. From seeing the media that came out around the process, they weren't interested. The government weren't interested. They just wanted to get these things blocked away.
Yeah, it seems to be typical government business, doesn't it, with regards to mental health, where they create a policy that is not a very good one, and rather than actually admitting their policy is wrong and backing away from that policy, they give you these mental health brochures and free counselling to help you deal with that bad policy.
I think this is done deliberately. They don't humanise that element of the seafood industry, particularly here in Queensland. I can't speak for New South Wales or other jurisdictions, but what I know up here is that they don't equate the fishing community with real fishing families, and it's one of those things about understanding the dynamics of our fisheries, which are predominantly worked by either micro businesses, so one or two people in a family, or a small business, so mum and dad and that sort of fourth generation fishing, or third or fourth generation fishing families, and that's lost in the messaging because it's something that they don't want the community to dwell on, and it's just a fact that we're small business operators, and these things hit home and then hit families, and particularly hit the fishermen who, in some cases, all they've done their professional lives is commercially fish, and some of them are at a stage, and my understanding is that the fishing fleet, the age is heading more towards retirement age, so we're getting an older fleet, getting older operators, and so having these things happen towards the end of a career makes it supremely difficult to move into other industries or retrain, and that's something we don't get offered at all. So assistance to retrain and look for other jobs or to transition to other industries, that help is just not offered or even considered as part of the process, because what the politics here is, if you humanise this industry and get people in the community seeing what we're actually about, which government won't do, then it'll build sympathy for what we're going through, and the government don't want to do that. So it's just about symbols and numbers, and it's we're left to our own devices, which is pretty disheartening. But that's the way it's gone, and it's nothing new as far as I can see.
Yeah, it makes it very easy to bulldoze an industry when you close your eyes, doesn't it? Look, finally, Eric, Queensland Government has released the Green Paper, looks to change the shape of the commercial industry further. Even after these net-free zones, it's just not enough. Industry has to go through this whole new process. Do you believe enough consideration has been given to the consumer in the paper?
They talk about changing the lay of the land for the community, but in terms of the seafood consumer, or those that don't have a capacity to go out and catch the fish for themselves, no, that's one of the areas that's lacking, in addition to, for example, impacts on the supply chain of the proposed changes they're putting up. Anyone who reads that document, and for those listening, if you want to read what potentially bad policy document is for industry, go to the Fisheries Queensland website and download the Green Paper. And it's a lot of motherhood statements. It's a lot of just sign up and we'll deal with things after you've given us the go ahead that you're positive about these potential changes. And for us, from an industry perspective, looking at what's there, it raises more questions than it answers. So I'm not doing my job by advising my members to say yes and wear whatever the consequences are after they bring out a white paper of their final policy document. It's a Paul Cousin version to the MRAG review, which was 290 pages of considered argument about what fisheries management could look like in the state.
Again, that was Eric from Queensland Seafood Industry Association. In New South Wales, Eddie Obeid introduced the saltwater component of the recreational fishing fee. This was intended to buy out commercial fishermen from areas to become exclusively accessed by the recreational fishers, meaning that more than 30% of lakes, rivers and estuaries are now inaccessible to seafood consumers. Next up, I interviewed Peter Johnson. Peter is the deputy leader for the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party. Pete has co-hosted on radio for the past 20 years and is also an avid recreational fisher. Howdy Pete, how are you going?
I'm well, thanks Dave, and thanks for having me on your podcast, mate.
Yeah, not a problem. So have you noticed the divide in the recreational sector, mate?
Well, Dane, here's the rub. I've noticed several things amongst the fraternity, or I guess subsets if you like. I've seen the rise of the holied and bow crowd. And they're those people who hide behind computers on social media and the ones that bay for blood when some happy fish out of has kept 6 or 7 bream or a nice full curlew flathead. Right through to the outright idiots who couldn't catch the fish, books thrown at them, and the blame of professionals for no fish being caught, etc., and everything in between. I do think that many people blame commercial fishers unfairly because I don't know. I guess they think because there's no fish left, blah blah. Well, they can't catch fish like we did 50 years ago. I mean, you know the story. You know what it's like, don't you? Lately, and probably most frightening is the so-called perceived, some of us call them the elite class. They're the ones that got the latest and expensive gear, the big flash boats, and they dress like a tournament angler. Some of us call them all the gear and no idea crew.
Oh, nice.
I mean, I've had these blokes laugh at me out on the rocks when I'm in the Dunlop volley cleats, and I still go down with me 7144 Butterworth and a 6-inch Alvey, and I'm fishing for tailor or pigs, and some of them will say it's about time you upgraded, pop, things like that. But a few hours later, when I'm bagged out on my tailor and pigs, and I walk past them, I love to look in their faces because they're still fishing, and particularly when I tell them it's time they learn to fish, and more importantly, learn to read the water because they're often fishing in the wrong spot.
Seems to be the case, doesn't it? Fishing in the wrong spot.
Yeah, look, another thing, I guess, Dane, and to be honest, I think slick marketing's convinced a lot of people that if you buy this, buy that, you wear this shirt, you'll catch more fish, or at least it inflates their egos. I mean, one thing you can't buy, and that's knowledge on fishing. I mean, look, you can go and watch YouTube, etc. But the way to learn was in the 60s through to the year 2000, and it's a bit after. The way to learn how to fish is to join a fishing club movement. You were blessed because if you were genuine, there were blokes there that would teach you the nuances and fine arts needed to be a top angler. Like you take the likes of Dick Lewis, John Bethune, Gary Chapman, Mike Hurst, Dave Linfield, etc. And some other old timers from my era was Brian Collins, Rod Burston, and coming through now the likes of Alex Bellissimo and many others who still run rings around these so-called elite. I mean, these elite people, they can't accept the days that they didn't catch their scale. They refuse to accept that they didn't know as much as the bloke in the BCF brochure told them they would. I mean, look, you're out of Patonga, Dane. How many times have you seen a flotilla of boats fishing on flint and steel, and none of them have been anchored in the wrong spot for a Jew, in close to the edge?
It cracks me up every time, Pete.
Yeah, heaps of times we've seen it. And I blame anyone or anything else for their poor choice of position. You can have an expensive boat, expensive gear and a flash sounder, but it's nothing if you don't know how to position your boat. Yeah,
very true. Same happens in the commercial sector where people come in thinking that all you have to do is own a boat and you can be the best commercial fisherman out there. It's not the case. You need the knowledge. You need to respect the fleet, and they'll teach you how to do it. The radical lobbyists in the recreational sector argue for commercial fishing closures, and they don't worry about the science. Now, do you think this has an impact or could impact on recreational fishing when there's calls for marine park from the environmental lobby?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, without a doubt. I really think it's folly to divide the ranks. I mean, it's easier for those that oppose fishing and support marine parks to get their agenda through, if you ask me. I mean, science and peer-reviewed science, and not this voodoo magic science that the Greenies use.
Yep.
It has to be leading factor for management. I mean, how often do you hear our government say at overseas symposiums that we have the best managed practices at international conferences, but they resort to listening to non-government organisations and antis in their own waters? I mean, it's really confusing to see them take the two stances. I mean, the Recs calling for closures should shut up, honestly, because once the commercial sector is gone, guess who's next? Guess who's next? The Recs have had years of being told that more marine parks are closed are coming, and they've done very little to help themselves. I mean, I've been campaigning now for 20-odd years to maintain access for anglers, and the apathy is really disturbing. They yell, they'll scream, and they say that the shooters, fishers and farmers don't do anything for them. But less than 3,500 rec anglers sent submissions in on the last review paper for bag limits. And the most frightening thing, Dane, was more submissions were sent by non-anglers.
Yeah, of course, and that seems to be the case with papers for marine parks and other reform papers where you get all these submissions from people that don't even know anything about fishing. So, finally, Pete, you know about the business adjustment program. Do you believe this process is fair, what we're going through?
Absolutely not. Should be thrown out. I mean, where do I start? It's an unfair process. Where on earth are you going to find a reform that basically says if you want to stay in the industry, you've got to go into debt to buy more shares to stay at a level you already exist? And after all that, you've got to go and secure a loan without a business plan because there is no security going forward. I mean, it's preposterous. The banks aren't going to loan you money to invest in your business without any growth. I mean, you know, the threat here is to consumers too, because they won't be having affordable, fresh, sustainable seafood, and bait fishers are going to have to buy a lot more than $20 worth of lures in the future. And school prawns and squid, they won't be available. I mean, you're one of the guys that supplies the bait market. You should know how it's going to affect them.
Yeah.
And well, look, as for the senior management, look, I'm not dealing with them per se, so I can only go on what I've seen and what I've read. And to be honest, that's not a happy story, but I think most importantly is that the minister's failed, and he's failed miserably. He doesn't have my confidence anymore. To finish up, Rex and Pros have got to stick together. Only 20% of New South Wales population fishes for their food or for their fun or for therapy, but they've still got to have a viable wild caught fishery to feed the other 80% of the people that don't. I mean, in the past, we've been told we're all well managed, sustainable, and viable. So why the need now for change? You know, Dane, I just don't understand it.
No. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Pete.
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to have a chat, Dane. I mean, very happy to talk about protecting your fishing access, whether it be for recreational or commercial fishermen. So thanks for the time and good luck with your podcast, mate.
Thanks, mate. Thanks again, Pete, from the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party. These closures are all implemented by government without the recognition of the pain and anguish caused on families involved. I've seen children in tears just thinking about the fact that they can no longer go and help with the nets. These are more than just closures, they are the loss of knowledge, family tradition, and even the loss of local seafood for the broader community. I have heard extreme lobbyists, when defending government's position on closures, say that people should catch a fish for themselves. This clearly demonstrates the complete ignorance towards the disabled, the elderly, and even the person that is too busy to catch a fish. Seafood consumers Australia-wide need to be mindful of what is happening to the industry that provides their seafood. At present, you can choose if you want to eat wild-caught Australian, farmed Australian, wild-caught imports, or farmed imports. If our politicians continue down this path and the seafood consumers do not stand behind the very small industry we have left, your choice will be taken from you. You are the voice, you are the votes. Only you have the power to say no to the radical movements that are trying to take your right to choose. The one thing you can count on, regardless of what these groups say, your wild-caught Australian seafood is sustainably harvested. If anyone dares to challenge the sustainability credentials of your locally sourced seafood, ask them for the science. Cheers for now. Until the next episode, please like and share my page. I'll see you again next time.